Story 1. The Cabin with No Neighbors. I booked the cabin on a whim, searching for some quiet escape from the city's constant noise. The listing promised solitude, a small wooden retreat tucked into the heart of the Appalachian Hills. I drove hours along winding, narrow roads, past dense forests where the trees seemed to lean in close, as if they were watching. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin sat, I realized how isolated it truly was. There were no other houses in sight, no smoke rising from chimneys, not even the faint glow of distant streetlights. The quiet hit me first, the kind of silence that makes your ears ache because it is so complete. It felt both peaceful and disconcerting. The cabin itself appeared rustic but charming, made of rough-hewn logs, with a small porch and a woodpile stacked neatly to one side. I parked and stepped out, taking in the air, cool, damp, tinged with the scent of pine and earth. That's when I first noticed the little details that didn't sit right. The front door was slightly ajar, even though the host had said it would be locked. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and something else I couldn't place. The furniture looked lived in. Chairs were not pushed under the table, and dishes sat drying on the counter as though someone had just eaten there, then stepped out for a moment. I reminded myself that sometimes hosts leave things like that to give a sense of homey comfort. But the feeling that I was stepping into someone else's private life made my skin crawl. I unpacked quickly, trying to shake off the unease. Night came fast in the mountains, and with it, a deep darkness that seemed to press against the windows and doors. I ate a simple dinner, keeping the lights on longer than I normally would, and then retired to the small bedroom. Around midnight, I heard it. The faintest scrape, a soft footfall on the wooden porch outside. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling the trees, but the steps continued, moving slowly, circling the cabin. I froze, straining to hear over my own rapid heartbeat. The steps would pause, then continue, heavier each time, deliberate, almost mocking. I got up and peered out the window. The forest beyond was a black mass, trees like tall shadows swaying gently, but then I thought I caught movement. Shadows darted between the trunks, too quick, always vanishing when I blinked or tried to focus. I convinced myself it was a deer, a raccoon, or some nocturnal animal wandering close, but the rhythm of the steps didn't match any creature I knew. They had purpose, a cadence that seemed almost human. I tried to sleep, telling myself it was my imagination, but I lay awake, listening until the early hours, my thoughts spinning. The next morning, I inspected the cabin more closely. Everything appeared normal in daylight, the strange little disturbances making less sense in the clear, bright light. I went for a hike nearby to clear my mind, the hills stretching into endless green, rivers glinting in the sun. But even walking among nature, I felt a weight of unease. When I returned to the cabin that evening, the subtle strangeness had returned. The dishes had shifted slightly. Chairs were not in the same place as I'd left them. It could have been the wind or a minor tremor from the hillside, but it made my stomach knot. That night, the footsteps returned, louder now, closer, circling the cabin with precision. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, shining it around the porch, but there was no one. The forest beyond remained motionless, yet I felt as though someone was there, just beyond the beam. A snapping twig, a low rustle, and the sensation of being watched pressed against my skin. I checked the perimeter of the cabin, circling slowly, hearing the wood creak under my own weight, but found nothing. That was when I realized the floorboards themselves didn't echo the sounds I had been hearing. These steps weren't mine, and they weren't random. By the third night, I was tense, jumpy, barely sleeping. My thoughts became disjointed as I tried to rationalize what I was hearing. I moved the furniture, checked the windows, locked every door repeatedly. It was then, during a futile search for the source of my anxiety, that I noticed a small, black object tucked in the corner of the bookshelf in the living room. At first, I thought it was just dust or a piece of old wiring, but when I crouched closer, I realized it was a hidden camera. The lens stared directly at the bed, tiny but unmistakable. Whoever had placed it here had been watching me the entire time. My stomach sank, my hands shaking as I realized how completely exposed I had been, how long someone, or multiple someones, had observed me in isolation. Panic replaced fear, and I gathered my belongings with a trembling urgency. I didn't stop to think about anything else. I left the cabin in darkness, heart hammering, my ears straining for the faintest echo of footsteps that might follow me. In the rearview mirror, as I drove down the winding mountain road, the cabin disappeared behind a curtain of trees. Yet the memory of the footsteps remained, haunting. They were quiet, calculated, deliberate, like the forest itself had been a stage for someone else's hidden amusement. I tried to tell myself it was just a deranged previous guest, some local kid with access to the property, but the precision of the surveillance suggested planning, patience. Whoever had done this knew I would come, knew I would be alone, and had waited silently for my arrival. The thought left a bitter taste in my mouth, a lingering dread that grew with every mile I put between myself and that cabin. Sleep did not come easily in the days after. Every creak of my apartment, every shadow cast by streetlights through the window, made my pulse quicken. I kept checking my doors, my windows, my phone, imagining hidden cameras in every corner. My friends joked about it, told me I was overreacting, that it was probably some coincidence or my imagination running wild after a few nights in the woods. But deep down, I knew what I had found wasn't coincidence. Someone had taken the time to plan, to observe, to invade my space in a way that left no sign until I discovered it by chance. I later tried to research the cabin, hoping to find something, reviews, news articles, complaints. The Airbnb page had been taken down without explanation. Reviews were sparse, the ones that remained generic. But one or two mentioned unsettling feelings, strange noises at night, and an overly keen host who seemed almost too attentive. I couldn't be sure if these were genuine warnings or just typical online exaggeration, but it confirmed what I had feared. I wasn't the first to feel watched, to notice the subtle disturbances that mark the place as wrong. Even now, months later, the memory of the footsteps lingers with me. Sometimes when the wind rattles the trees outside my window or a floorboard creaks under my own feet, I feel it. The same deliberate, encircling presence that had haunted those Appalachian nights. I try to rationalize it, to tell myself the camera was a one-time intrusion, that I was lucky to leave when I did. But the truth is, I can't erase the feeling that I wasn't truly alone. The forest had kept its secret, silent yet vigilant, and whoever had chosen that cabin as their stage had left an imprint not on the walls, but on my memory. I've avoided the mountains since then. The thought of returning to a similar, isolated cabin fills me with an inexplicable dread, a deep, gut-level fear that doesn't respond to logic. And yet, I sometimes find myself wondering, how long had I really been alone? How long had someone watched, waiting, hidden in the folds of the forest and the shadows of the cabin? The thought chills me more than the mountain air ever could. Even in my own home, I can't shake the sensation of being observed. I check the corners of rooms, inspect windows, look behind doors before sitting down. My phone, my computer, even my mailbox. I imagine them as instruments of surveillance, tools that someone could use to monitor, to record. It's irrational, I know, yet the memory of that cabin clings to me, a weight lodged deep in my mind. I try to occupy myself with work, friends, ordinary routines, but when silence falls and I am alone, the sensation creeps back, as if those footsteps are circling once more just outside, in the shadowed periphery of my life. I haven't told many people about what happened, and those I have told tend to dismiss it as paranoia. But I remember every detail, the faint smell of smoke that never dissipated, the subtle misplacement of chairs and dishes, the way shadows flickered in the periphery of my vision. I remember the soft, deliberate steps circling the cabin that first night, and the dreadful realization that someone had been watching me the entire time, perhaps even before I arrived. There was a method to it, a patience that made my own fear seem small by comparison. And though I have tried to move past it, I know, deep down, that the memory of that cabin, of the forested isolation, of being observed and hunted without ever seeing the hunter, will remain with me forever. Even tonight I wake momentarily to silence, only to hear the faintest echo of wood creaking somewhere in my apartment. My mind immediately travels back to that cabin, the steps circling in the dark, shadows darting just beyond my sight. I shiver, realizing how little control I truly had, and how small I really was in the presence of someone or something that had orchestrated my fear so perfectly. I can no longer differentiate between what was real and what my memory has magnified. All I know is the dread, the quiet, the relentless feeling of being watched. The cabin remains in my thoughts like a scar I cannot touch. I try to rationalize the surveillance camera as the work of a prankster or a negligent host, yet the precision of it, the placement, the way it watched everything I did, my panic, my fear, my most vulnerable moments, tells me it was far more deliberate than that. I imagine someone sitting in the shadows, waiting, learning, patient. I imagine the same quiet corners of the Appalachian forest, holding secrets that will never be uncovered, their silence more terrifying than any shout or scream. I left, yes, but the footsteps, the careful observation, the weight of unseen eyes, all of it stayed with me, etched into my memory in a way that no distance, no light, no rationalization can erase. I sometimes wonder, when I see a cabin nestled deep in the hills or a solitary road winding through darkened trees, if others have had the same experience, if they have felt the quiet dread, the subtle disturbances, the way your own mind begins to question every sound, every shadow, every creak. And I think of the camera still tucked in that corner, still pointing toward the bed, still capturing every detail of a world I can never truly leave behind. It is an intimacy I never asked for, a violation of solitude I can never fully understand. Even now, writing this, I can feel the residue of that cabin pressing against my chest, the isolation of the mountains, the supposed beauty and peace. It becomes a stage for something quiet, patient, and profoundly unsettling. I try to forget, but the memory returns in the wind, in the trees, in every silent moment I'm alone. I know that my fear, my anxiety, is rooted in something real, something I experienced, and yet it is something I can never articulate fully to another person. They will never understand the creeping tension that comes from being watched without knowing when or why, the sense that every shadow may conceal more than you are ready to confront. I will never return to that place. I cannot. And yet, the memory of it, the quiet, deliberate, patient footsteps circling the cabin, the shadowed corners and the hidden camera, will follow me until the end of my days. Sometimes I think I hear them still, just beyond my window, just beyond the edge of perception, circling, patient, waiting. Story 2. The Locked Attic Room. I arrived at the farmhouse late in the afternoon, the sun already hanging low behind the hills that rolled endlessly into the distance. The host had given me vague directions, emphasizing that the house was just a bit old-fashioned, though I didn't quite understand until I pulled up to the property. The structure was imposing in its own way. A 2-story farmhouse with peeling paint, a sagging porch, and weathered shutters that clung stubbornly to their hinges. Every step I took on the wooden porch made it groan beneath my weight, and I realized immediately that the house had its own way of announcing each visitor. The smell was the first thing that struck me. Damp earth mixed with the lingering smoke of a long, cold fire, and something else I couldn't place, faint but pervasive, like mildew wrapped in dust. The interior was just as creaking and uneven as I expected. Floorboards bowed beneath my weight, and the narrow staircase that led to the second floor seemed to sag in the middle, as if carrying the memory of decades of footsteps. I set my bag down and began inspecting the rooms, feeling a mix of fascination and unease. Everything seemed lived in, yet abandoned, as though the house had once been full of life, but had grown tired of human presence. That's when I noticed the attic door. It was a small, old panel at the end of the upstairs hallway, the brass knob dulled by time. I asked the host about it during my tour. "Oh, that's just storage," she said, brushing off my curiosity. "Nothing in there anyone needs. Old furniture, boxes, really just junk." She didn't offer more, and her avoidance felt strange, deliberate even. My mind immediately began speculating. Locked doors always spark a curiosity you can't quite ignore. That night, as I lay in the small guest room, the attic door weighed on my mind. I kept imagining what might be behind it, just old belongings, or perhaps something else entirely. Eventually, the need to know gnawed too strongly, and I convinced myself I could handle whatever I found. I waited until the house was quiet. The only sounds the occasional groan of timber or a gust of wind rattling the shutters. The lock was old and rudimentary, and with careful patience, I managed to pick it. The click echoed slightly in the empty hallway, and for a moment I froze, imagining someone had heard me. I opened the door slowly. The attic smelled of damp wood and old smoke, as if it had been sealed against time itself. Heavy sheets covered the furniture, their shapes suggesting long unused chairs and a desk. Dust floated in the beams of my flashlight, motes suspended in the air like tiny spectres. I hesitated at the center of the room, then noticed a corner that was different. There was a collection of personal belongings, carefully arranged despite the decay elsewhere. Stacks of letters, scattered photographs, and journals that seemed unnervingly recent. Something about the items felt alive, as if they had been left deliberately for someone to discover. I knelt and picked up a journal, flipping the pages carefully. At first, they seemed to be the musings of previous guests, each entry cataloguing their days in the house. Then, the tone shifted. Names were mentioned, detailed descriptions of the house, sometimes referencing an unseen presence. "He knows when I wake," one entry read. Another, "The watcher follows even when I think I am alone." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself these were mere flights of imagination or attempts at storytelling, but there was a consistency to the entries, a pattern that made my heart beat faster. I kept reading, unable to stop, and the hours slipped by. The house grew colder as night deepened, shadows stretching across the sloped ceiling, and I became acutely aware of the silence around me. Not the normal silence of an empty house, but something heavier, more deliberate, the kind of quiet that seems to listen. Eventually, I set the journal down and climbed back into bed, trying to dismiss the stories as fiction. Sleep came fitfully. Around midnight, I woke to a faint scratching sound at the attic door. My eyes flew open, heart hammering, and I froze, listening. The noise was soft, but distinct, deliberate, fingernails or a small tool scraping lightly against the wood. My first thought was that it was the wind, but the sound followed a rhythm, starting and stopping as if testing me or warning me. I held my breath, imagining shapes in the ceiling shadows, the possibility of someone moving silently above me. The scratching stopped after several minutes, and I lay awake until the first light of dawn, imagining every possible scenario, each more frightening than the last. When I finally got up, I approached the attic door, expecting it to be empty. The lock was still in place, undisturbed, yet all of the letters and journals I had been reading were gone. The corner of personal belongings was empty. The dust undisturbed as if nothing had ever been there. My stomach twisted. Someone, or something, had removed them while I slept. I searched the house, checked the windows, every nook and cranny, but the items were gone. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone had been in the house while I was asleep. The realization left me shaken, the sense of being monitored, of someone knowing my movements, my thoughts, had only deepened overnight. I spent the rest of the morning packing, unable to eat or focus. I left the farmhouse with a trembling sense of urgency, feeling as though the house itself was aware of my departure. The wind seemed sharper that day, cutting through the hollows of the hills, and every snapping twig behind me made my pulse quicken. I avoided the road down the mountain, taking longer paths through unfamiliar trails, desperate to put distance between myself and the house. But even as the town began to reappear, with its scattered homes and faint smoke rising from chimneys, the weight of the attic, the journals, the sense of a watcher clung to me. Over the following days, I tried to return to normal life, but the memories haunted me. Shadows seemed to move in the corner of my vision, and I sometimes imagined faint, scratching at my bedroom door, even though I was now hundreds of miles from the farmhouse. I realized with an uneasy clarity that the experience had lodged itself in my mind in a way that could not be erased. The locked door, the hidden journals, the whispers of an unseen presence. They had become a part of me. I thought about going back, about investigating more formally, perhaps contacting the host or authorities. But something inside me resisted, an instinctual understanding that the house was private in a way no one could intrude upon without consequence. I never returned to that area, and I avoided other mountain cabins for years, driven not by common sense but by a visceral memory of isolation, silence, and observation. Every creak of floorboards, every faint smell of smoke or damp wood reminded me of the farmhouse, of the locked attic, of being watched without ever seeing the watcher. Even now, when I recount the experience to friends or family, I see skepticism in their eyes. They call it imagination, exaggeration, the products of stress or loneliness. But I remember the journals, each meticulously detailed, each describing the presence of something unseen, patient and deliberate. I remember the scratching at the attic door, the sudden absence of the items I had read only hours before. I remember the smell of mildew mixed with smoke, the oppressive quiet, the way the house seemed to shift subtly when I was present. These memories are indelible. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself imagining the farmhouse, picturing the locked attic, the corner where the journals once lay. I think about the sequence of events, the methodical removal of the documents while I slept, the sense that someone had been tracking my curiosity, measuring my responses, understanding my fear. It is not the presence of a person that terrifies me now, but the realization that someone or something had observed me so completely, unseen and patient. The attention, the knowledge of my every movement lingers in my memory like a shadow that refuses to fade. I have avoided mountain towns, rural cabins, and any place that might echo that isolation. I find it difficult to trust hosts or rentals, and I sometimes imagine hidden spaces behind every locked door. The fear is not violent or immediate, it is quiet, subtle and persistent. It lives in the periphery, in the rustling of trees, the groaning of old wood, the faint scratching that might only exist in my mind. And yet, I know what I experienced was real, as tangible as the dust motes floating in the attic, as real as the smell of smoke and mildew that I can still recall. The memory of the farmhouse follows me, not in the form of nightmares or hallucinations, but as a persistent, unsettling awareness. It reminds me of how easily one can be observed, how small and vulnerable one becomes in isolation, and how little control we truly have over our surroundings when curiosity leads us to the wrong place. The locked attic, the removed journals, the patient presence, all of it continues to resonate. A quiet warning of the unseen watchers that may exist even in places we think are empty. Even now, when I see an old farmhouse, a weathered door, or a window obscured by curtains, I pause. I feel the old dread creeping back, the same weight that pressed on me in that attic. I can almost hear the faintest scratching in the corners of my mind, as if reminding me that some spaces are never truly empty, that some secrets are never meant to be uncovered. I can no longer ignore that sensation, cannot simply dismiss it as imagination. It is part of me now, lodged in memory like a splinter, a reminder that even the quietest, most isolated places can be full of watchful eyes, patient and deliberate, waiting for someone curious enough to notice. And so I carry it with me, the farmhouse, the locked attic, the journals, and the sense of being observed. It is not something I can leave behind. The fear has transformed into a muted vigilance, a constant awareness of my surroundings, a subtle tension in the back of my mind. I no longer wander through silence as I once did. I do not trust the shadows or the creak of old boards. The experience taught me that some places, no matter how quaint or inviting they seem, harbor more than memories. They harbor presence. Story 3, The Endless Hallway. When I first arrived at the Airbnb, I was enchanted by its rustic charm. The house sat atop a ridge, surrounded by dense Appalachian forest, the kind of place where the air smells of moss and pine resin, and sunlight barely reaches the forest floor through the thick canopy. From the outside, the home looked like something out of a postcard. Weathered wood siding, a wraparound porch, and flowering shrubs that had somehow survived the mountain cold. The drive up the winding dirt road had been nerve-wracking, but the isolation promised the escape I'd been craving. I unpacked my bags and settled in, feeling a rare sense of peace in the quiet. The first night passed without incident. I explored the main floor, noting the low ceilings and narrow doorways, the way the floorboards creaked underfoot, but I chalked it up to age. The kitchen smelled faintly of wood smoke, and a fireplace sat cold but inviting. Everything seemed ordinary, if old-fashioned, and I was grateful for the solitude. By the next morning, I was ready to explore the second floor, which the listing described as containing bedrooms and a small study. The staircase was steep and narrow, and each step groaned as though complaining at my weight. I reached the top and immediately noticed the hallway. It stretched far longer than it should have, considering the dimensions of the house. I counted the doors along its sides, 5, maybe 6, but something about the spacing seemed wrong. Doors led to rooms that didn't match any floor plan I could imagine. I entered one at random and found an empty bedroom, slightly musty, with a bed pushed to one side. Another door revealed what appeared to be a storage closet, then another a small bathroom. But each time I returned to the hallway, it felt subtly different. The doors seemed further apart or closer together, and the walls themselves seemed to lean at odd angles. At first, I assumed it was fatigue, or perhaps the result of the uneven floorboards, but unease quickly took root. By the second night, I was hesitant to walk the hallway alone. Every time I passed, I felt the weight of it pressing against me, like the corridor itself was aware of my movement, testing my attention. The light cast by my flashlight or the hallway sconces didn't behave normally. Shadows pooled in the corners in ways I couldn't predict. I began noticing details I hadn't seen the night before. A scuff mark on one doorframe, a faint stain on the carpet, a subtle shift in the position of the furniture visible through open doors. It was disorienting, unnerving, but always subtle enough that I questioned my own senses. One evening, unable to resist the growing curiosity, I opened a door I had never noticed before. It was narrow, unassuming, with a simple brass knob. As I pushed it open, I was met with a small room, barely larger than a walk-in closet, and lined entirely with mirrors. The air inside was heavy and cool, smelling faintly of old varnish and dust. I stepped in cautiously and saw myself reflected countless times, each mirror angled slightly differently. That alone would have been enough to unsettle anyone. But then, I noticed something impossible. Shadows flickering behind me in the reflections, moving independently of my own form. I spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. The mirrors were blank, reflecting only the room itself and me. Panic rose quickly. My instinct screamed at me to leave, and I bolted from the room, sprinting down the hallway as quickly as the narrow passage would allow. The hallway stretched on and on, longer than it had any right to be, doors appearing and disappearing at odd intervals. My mind reeled. I reached the bottom of the stairs and found myself gasping for breath in the main hall. I immediately sought out the host, hoping for some rational explanation. She listened with mild amusement, brushing off my concerns, assuring me that the house's layout was old but standard, that perhaps I was simply tired or imagining things. Reluctantly, I agreed to return with her to the second floor, but when we reached the hallway, everything was normal. The doors were evenly spaced, the hallway ended where it should, and the room with mirrors was nowhere to be found. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, a sense of vertigo and disbelief. The house had shown me something that could not exist, or it had manipulated me in a way I could not comprehend. I began questioning my own memory, my own perceptions, but the unease persisted. There was no logical reason for the hallway to stretch, the doors to appear or vanish, or the mirrors to show shadows that weren't real. I spent the remainder of the night on the first floor, unwilling to ascend the stairs again. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of wind outside seemed amplified in my mind. Sleep was fitful. I imagined myself walking the endless hallway, doors opening and closing silently, mirrors reflecting not just myself, but other presences just beyond my perception. Morning brought little comfort. The house looked ordinary in daylight, serene even, but the memory of the hallway haunted me. I felt watched. Not in the sense of someone standing nearby, but as though the structure itself observed me, patient and deliberate, aware of each movement I made. The following day, I explored the surrounding property, trying to ground myself in something tangible. The woods were dense, the paths winding and overgrown, yet familiar in a natural way. Birds called to one another, and the wind rustled through the pines in a familiar cadence. But even here, I felt the echo of the hallway, a lingering sense that the house's strangeness extended beyond its walls. Each tree, each shadow, reminded me of the corridor and the impossibility I had witnessed. I realized then that the house had altered my perception, challenged my sense of reality, in a way that left me permanently unsettled. That night, I forced myself to ascend the stairs, determined to confront the hallway again. Each step felt heavier, more deliberate, as though the house anticipated my approach. I walked the corridor slowly, counting the doors, noting their position, their appearance. Yet my mind betrayed me. One door seemed slightly ajar that hadn't been the night before. I tried to ignore it, but curiosity and fear mingled, compelling me to push it open. It was empty, just another bedroom, but the hallway stretched beyond it in an unnatural way, the walls seeming to shift subtly as I moved. I turned and ran once more, descending the staircase and refusing to return for the remainder of my stay. By the final morning, I packed hastily, the unease pressing at my chest like a physical weight. I left without saying goodbye to the host, murmuring some vague excuse about having to leave early. The drive down the mountain was tense, every shadow along the roadside making me glance over my shoulder. The forest closed in around the narrow road, as if the trees themselves were conspiring to keep me trapped. Yet I eventually emerged into clearer terrain, the familiar signs of civilization offering some relief. Still, the memory of that hallway and the shifting doors lingered, a quiet dread that settled in the back of my mind. Even weeks later, the image of the endless hallway returns. I dream of it sometimes. Walking slowly past doors that lead nowhere, mirrors reflecting shadows that vanish when I try to focus. I recall the sense of being small and vulnerable in that strange, patient space. The way the house seemed to toy with my perceptions, testing the limits of my awareness. The fear is subtle but persistent, a quiet, gnawing tension that resurfaces in moments of solitude or silence. I cannot rationalize it, cannot explain it to anyone in a way that would make sense. I have avoided mountain rentals since that visit. I hesitate even to drive through similar terrain, wary of the isolation, the narrow roads, and the potential for spaces that manipulate the mind in ways I cannot anticipate. The experience has left me acutely aware of how fragile perception can be, how easily reality can be bent by something as simple as a hallway, a door, or the faint reflection of a shadow. I do not know whether the house was haunted, abandoned, or simply designed in some old, peculiar way. What I know is that it challenged me, left me questioning my own senses, and reminded me that isolation in the mountains can reveal truths that are unsettling, inexplicable, and profoundly disorienting. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can see it. The endless hallway, stretching beyond reason, doors shifting subtly, mirrors reflecting what should not exist. The memory presses against me not with overt violence, but with quiet insistence. I am left with a lingering doubt about my own perception, a sense that the world is more fragile than I had believed, and a fear that even in familiar spaces, there may be corridors that stretch beyond our understanding, waiting for someone curious or unfortunate enough to wander them. Story 4: The Whispering Porch. I arrived at the Airbnb late in the afternoon, the fading sunlight slicing through the Appalachian canopy, casting long, dappled shadows across the driveway. The house itself was deceptively quaint, a large, weathered structure with a covered porch stretching along the front, wide enough for several rocking chairs. From the moment I stepped onto the porch, I felt the quiet, that peculiar mountain quiet that seems to press against you in a way the valley never does. The air smelled of pine, damp earth, and something older, something that seemed to hang in the forest like a memory. I dropped my bags inside, noting the polished wood floors and the smell of varnish mixed with faint smoke, as if the house had once been warm with fire but hadn't been tended in months. The first night was peaceful enough, the kind of quiet that feels like a lullaby until you start noticing the spaces between sounds. I sat on the porch with a mug of tea, listening to the wind through the trees. Occasionally, a branch scraped against the roof. A distant owl called, but otherwise there was nothing. It was almost too quiet, that oppressive kind of quiet that makes the mind start searching for things that aren't there. Around midnight, I first heard it, a soft whisper, so faint I almost didn't register it. I froze, my mug halfway to my lips, straining to hear. It was indistinct, a gentle murmur like voices carried over a distance. Just out of comprehension. I told myself it was the wind, or perhaps the trees brushing against one another, and went inside, trying to shake off the unease. The second night, the whispering returned, and this time it seemed closer. I was lying in bed when I heard it, soft, almost conversational, circling the porch. I could swear the sound moved, shifting from one end to the railing to the other. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to catch a word, a syllable, anything. But the voices remained elusive, teasing. Every time I blinked, they seemed to shift again, retreating slightly, then approaching. My stomach knotted, and I tried to tell myself it was imagination, the product of isolation and fatigue. But there was an unmistakable rhythm, a cadence that suggested intelligence, awareness. Unable to resist, I stepped onto the porch. The night was dense, the sky nearly black, the trees looming like silent sentinels. I stood frozen, listening, and the whispering intensified, circling me now, rising and falling like a tide. I turned slowly, scanning the darkness between the trees, expecting to see someone, anyone, but there was nothing. No movement, no flicker of a lantern, no shadow of a figure. Only the whispers moving around me as if the forest itself had learned to speak, or someone had taken residence just beyond the edge of sight. I felt small, exposed, as though the trees themselves were observing me. I retreated inside and locked the doors, my hands trembling. Sleep was shallow, punctuated by the occasional rustle from the porch. By the third night, the whispering had grown bolder. I could hear it from inside the house, circling near the door, then drifting toward the far end of the porch. I felt like a trespasser in my own accommodation, a visitor unwelcome in a house that seemed to belong to the mountains themselves. I didn't want to investigate further, but I couldn't help myself. I stepped outside once more, feeling the cool night air brush against my skin. The whispering followed, louder now, distinct, even though the words remained impossible to understand. I moved along the railing, circling slowly, trying to track the voices. My heart pounded, as if aware of the danger I couldn't see. Each step seemed to shift the sound's location, sometimes close to my side, sometimes behind me. I called out, hesitantly at first, then with growing panic. "Hello?" My voice seemed swallowed by the forest. Unheard. The whispering responded in kind, circling me faster, pressing closer, though still impossibly distant. I tried to see the source, and yet the porch was empty, the chairs still, the railing clear. Nothing moved except for the shadows cast by the dim light of the porch lamp, which flickered faintly in the night wind. By the morning, I felt hollowed out. The whispering had left a residue, a weight in my chest that did not dissipate with daylight. I avoided the porch as much as I could, staying inside, the windows closed, the doors locked. But the sense of being followed, of a presence just beyond perception, lingered. I spent the day walking the forest trails, hoping that distance from the house would calm my nerves, but every rustle in the underbrush, every branch scraping another, made me flinch. Even the wind carried a hint of the murmur I'd heard the night before, and I felt the mountains pressing in, patient and watching. I left after only 3 nights, packing in a fog of unease. The drive down the mountain felt unnaturally long. Shadows clung to the curves of the road, trees leaning over me as if following. Even with the house behind me, the whispering lingered, faint but insistent, echoing in my mind as if the forest had learned my name, as if it had been speaking to me all along. In the weeks afterward, whenever I drive through the Appalachians, the memory returns. The murmur of voices, the circling whispers, the feeling of being encircled by unseen presences. It is persistent, impossible to shake. I cannot explain it. I cannot rationalize it. I only know that there are places deep in the mountains where the silence carries a language you cannot understand, and it will find you if you listen too closely. Even now, when I picture the porch, the forest beyond seems alive, waiting, patient. I can almost hear it when the wind is right, faint, low, like a voice brushing the back of my mind. I have avoided renting in the mountains since, afraid of that quiet that is never truly quiet, of spaces that can listen and speak without form, of the persistent circling presence that reminds me how small, how vulnerable, and how alone one can be, even in a place meant for rest. Story 5. The Forgotten Keys. I arrived at the stone house just as the sun was slipping behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the narrow road that led to it. The Airbnb was older than I expected, its grey stones weathered by decades of wind and rain, and the ivy crawling up the walls gave it an almost ancient feel. The host, a thin woman with a hesitant smile, handed me a ring of keys, each labelled with a room. Most of them were mundane: kitchen, living room, bedroom, but one key read basement. She flinched slightly when I asked about it, saying only that it was rarely used and that I probably wouldn't need it. Her voice carried a note of unease I couldn't quite place. That first evening, I explored the house. The floors creaked beneath my feet. The walls were thick and cold, and the air smelled faintly of old wood and dust. Everything seemed ordinary enough, yet the basement key lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake the sense that the locked door held something important, something the host didn't want me to see. I tried to ignore it as I settled in, lighting a fire in the living room and unpacking my things. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes every sound, the wind through the trees, the settling of the stone walls, feel unnaturally loud. On the second night, curiosity finally got the better of me. I had been sitting at the kitchen table running my fingers over the ring of keys when I noticed one taped to the underside of the table. It was small, tarnished, and fit perfectly into the basement lock. My stomach twisted with a mix of fear and excitement as I made my way to the basement door. The key turned with a reluctant click, and the door creaked open to reveal a darkness that smelled of damp earth and decay. I swallowed hard, feeling the chill rise up my spine as I stepped inside. The basement was larger than I expected, low-ceilinged and cavernous, lined with stone walls that glistened with moisture. Rusted furniture leaned against the walls, coated in dust and cobwebs. I moved slowly, careful not to disturb anything, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. On the floor, scattered across the cold stone, were old newspaper clippings. As I bent down to read them, a knot of unease tightened in my stomach. The articles detailed disappearances spanning decades, people who had vanished without explanation, their names and faces preserved in yellowing paper. I felt a cold sweat break out on my back. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Perhaps the previous owner had collected them, maybe as a historian or local archivist. But the haphazard way they were spread across the floor, mixed with rusted tools and broken furniture, suggested something else, something darker. The air felt heavier with every step, and I began to hear faint sounds, barely perceptible, the jingling of keys. I froze, straining to listen. It was soft at first, almost like a trick of the imagination, then more distinct, as if someone or something was playing with keys somewhere deeper in the basement. Panic set in. I realized I had no way of knowing if the sound was above me or below, in some hidden corner. Every shadow seemed to move independently, stretching along the walls, curling toward me with a slow, deliberate creep. I fumbled back toward the stairs, the jingling growing louder, more persistent, each clink echoing through the stone like a heartbeat. I didn't stop to look back, but the sound lingered in my mind, insistent and unnerving, as though the basement itself had a life of its own. I reached the top of the stairs and slammed the door shut, pressing my back against it. My heart hammering. The keys in my pocket felt heavier than they should, as if burdened with the weight of whatever had been down there. I packed hastily that night, my sleep shallow and fitful, filled with the faint memory of jingling keys echoing through dark corridors. I left the stone house the next morning, my hands still trembling, my eyes darting to every shadow along the mountain road. Even now, weeks later, the memory lingers. Occasionally, when I'm alone in quiet places, I hear a faint clink, soft enough that no one else notices, like keys sliding against each other, moving in a rhythm that is just beyond comprehension. I wonder if the basement door will always exist in that house, locked or unlocked, holding its collection of memories and whispers, and whether someone or something still plays with the keys I found, patient and unseen. The sound follows me in ways I cannot escape, a quiet, persistent reminder that curiosity in the mountains sometimes uncovers things better left alone. Story 6. The Stranger Upstairs. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the ridges of the Appalachian hills. The place looked exactly as the listing had described. Rustic, weathered, isolated. It sat off a narrow gravel road tucked among pines and oaks, with a small porch that seemed to sag under decades of snow and wind. I parked, stretched, and took a slow look around. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and wood smoke, and I felt a rare sense of relief to finally be somewhere quiet. The cabin was small but welcoming. One bedroom, a living area with a stone fireplace, and a modest kitchen. It had the kind of charm that made you feel you'd stepped into a different time. The first night passed without incident, though I couldn't shake the creaks of the floorboards. Old houses have their quirks, I thought, shifting in their foundations and settling under the weight of the forest around them. But the second night was different. Around midnight, I woke to the unmistakable sound of movement upstairs. At first, I tried to convince myself it was a branch scraping against the roof, or perhaps the wind rattling a shutter. Then I heard the floorboards creak again, slowly, deliberately, pacing back and forth. My heart thudded in my chest. The cabin had only one bedroom, and I was alone. I stayed still, listening. There was a soft murmur, almost like someone talking quietly to themselves. It wasn't loud enough to make out words, but it had rhythm, cadence, as though the voice belonged to someone pacing and thinking, someone alive. I lay frozen under the covers, straining my ears. Every step was distinct, measured, heavy enough to suggest a presence. I wanted to call out, to demand to know who was there, but my throat tightened. Part of me felt safer not knowing. The next day, I explored the cabin carefully, checking every room. Everything was as it should be. The bedroom was empty, the floors swept, the furniture in its place. But there was a subtle disturbance I hadn't noticed before. Pillows fluffed as if recently used, doors left slightly ajar, and a faint indentation on the chair in the corner. I shook my head and told myself I must be imagining it, the product of fatigue and the unsettling silence. I resolved to ignore it. That night, the noises returned. I could hear the steps pacing again, faint murmurs drifting from the ceiling, a shadow sometimes flicking just beyond the stairwell. I tried to stay calm, to rationalize what I was hearing. Perhaps a wild animal had gotten into the attic, or the wind had shifted just so, but deep down, I knew it wasn't ordinary. The steps had intention, the whispers timing, a presence that occupied the space above me with careful attention. I couldn't see anyone, and yet I felt watched, monitored, as if the air itself had been claimed by another. Curiosity eventually overcame fear. I crept up the narrow stairs, flashlight in hand, each step trembling under my weight. The room at the top was empty, the bed was made, the floor swept, and yet the sense of recent occupation was palpable. A chair had been moved slightly, and the pillows bore the subtle imprint of a body. I scanned the corners of the room, shining the light carefully, but there was nothing. No one, only the echo of the past few nights, lingering in the dust motes and the shifting shadows. I began to notice other signs, subtle and almost imperceptible. The floorboards would settle moments before I reached them, as if warning me. A chair would be slightly angled when I returned from the kitchen. The whisper of breath, imagined or real, seemed to brush past my ear, and the shadow I caught occasionally near the stairwell vanished the moment I blinked. The presence wasn't overt, it didn't threaten, it simply existed, patient and careful, aware of my awareness. It was a reminder that I was not alone. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the pacing, the murmurs, the quiet retreat of a shadow just beyond reach. I began leaving the lights on, the television humming, anything to fill the silence. Yet the sensation never truly dissipated. Even in daylight, I felt it in the quiet corners, in the subtle shifts of furniture, the slight squeak of floorboards under unseen weight. The cabin's solitude, once comforting, had become a trap. By the third night, I could no longer endure it. I resolved to stay in the living room, flashlight in hand, watching the stairwell. Hours passed with no sound, the stillness pressing on me. Then, as if the cabin had grown impatient with my defiance, I heard it. A single step, deliberate and slow, descending the stairs. My heart slammed in my chest, and I spun the flashlight toward the stairwell. The beam caught nothing. Empty space, shadows playing along the walls. But the step's echo lingered, heavy and real. I realized then that I could never fully see the presence. It existed just beyond vision, patient, waiting for recognition, but never revealing itself fully. I left the cabin early the next morning, my things hastily packed. The host seemed surprised but didn't press me for an explanation. I couldn't bring myself to recount what had happened. I told myself it was fatigue, stress, a trick of the mind. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone in that cabin. The memory of pacing footsteps, the murmured whispers, and the retreating shadows stayed with me long after I drove away, creeping into quiet moments when I least expected it. Even now, weeks later, I recall the cabin with a strange mixture of fear and fascination. The thought of that room, the stairwell, and the silent observer lingers in the corners of my mind. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine the slow creak of floorboards above me, the faint murmur that never fully forms into words. It is a reminder of the fragile boundary between solitude and company, of how even an empty space can hold the weight of presence, patient, careful, and relentless. The cabin showed me something I cannot explain, a quiet horror that isn't loud or violent, but deeply unsettling. I cannot erase it from memory, nor can I fully understand it. The stranger upstairs was never seen, never touched, and yet I knew with certainty that I had not been alone. Story 7, The Refrigerator Notes. I arrived at the Airbnb in late afternoon, the mountain air crisp and cold, the road narrow and winding, flanked by pines that stretched toward the sky like silent, watchful sentinels. The listing had made the cabin seem cozy, rustic, secluded, with a small porch and an open living area. From the moment I parked, I felt the quiet pressing in on me. It wasn't just the absence of traffic or voices, it was a deeper silence, the kind that made every creak of the cabin floor, every wind-whipped pine needle ring out sharper than it should. I carried my bag inside, noting the modest furnishings and the slightly musty smell of wood and old fabric. Everything seemed ordinary enough. Yet there was a subtle tension in the air, a feeling that the space had been waiting for someone, waiting in a way that didn't involve me at all. The first thing I noticed inside was the refrigerator. On its front were a series of notes held by colourful magnets. At first glance they seemed harmless, reminders to buy groceries, doodles, a name written in careful script, perhaps left by previous guests. I smiled, thinking of it as a quaint touch, something that made the cabin feel lived in, even in its isolation. I didn't pay much attention at first, unpacking my things and settling into the small living space. But that evening, as I made myself a cup of tea, I noticed that one note had changed. It wasn't there when I had looked earlier, and now it read, "Don't forget your tea at 8. I paused, scanning the cabin. I hadn't mentioned a routine, hadn't said a word about tea, yet the note was addressed in a way that felt deliberate, personal. I shook my head, telling myself it was a coincidence. Perhaps the previous guests had left a habit tracker, or maybe the host had written something to anticipate a guest's routine. I set the note aside, thinking little more of it, but a creeping unease began to settle in my chest. That night, as I lay in the bedroom, the silence of the mountains pressing against the walls, I imagined someone standing in the kitchen, writing more notes, cataloguing my presence, though I knew it was impossible. The cabin's quiet made even the smallest sound, an owl, the wind, the settling of the floorboards, seem amplified, and I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was being observed. By the second day, the notes had multiplied. I found one on the fridge that read, "You went for a walk this morning. Watch your step on the creek stones." I froze, realizing I hadn't mentioned the walk to anyone. My stomach turned over, a low knot of fear tightening in my gut. Every note I found after that seemed to anticipate my day, reminders of meals, subtle references to objects I had touched, things I had only thought aloud to myself. One note simply said, "Cup on the table, handle facing left." I remembered placing it exactly that way a few minutes earlier, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps there was some hidden camera, some elaborate prank the host had set up. But the house felt too old, too remote. There were no obvious wires or devices, no indications that anyone had been inside while I was away. The notes weren't just reminders. They were intimate, precise, almost like the cabin itself had been observing me, storing details I hadn't shared aloud. I stopped moving freely, finding myself checking my own actions, conscious of every step, every touch, every glance. The third day brought something worse. I woke to find a new note on the fridge. "You'll wake at 7:15 and have breakfast at 8. My pulse spiked. I looked at the clock. 7:15. Exactly. My hands trembled as I made my way to the kitchen, the note's words echoing in my mind. I had not told anyone my schedule, had not left any clues, yet it was as if someone, or something, had been tracking me with unnerving accuracy. I began searching the cabin for signs of surveillance, cameras, mirrors angled in unusual ways, even tiny holes drilled into the walls. There was nothing. The place was empty, quiet, ordinary in every other respect, yet the notes persisted, unnervingly precise, reflecting a knowledge that should have been impossible. I started documenting the notes, photographing them as they appeared, trying to prove to myself that this was something tangible and explainable. Each day, the notes became more elaborate, observations about my habits, predictions about what I would do, even subtle warnings. "You'll spill a bit of tea if you lift the cup too quickly. The book you picked up will fall tonight." I began to move cautiously, almost in fear of triggering the next note. Every sound, creaking floorboards, wind rattling against the windows, felt like a signal. The cabin seemed alive, cataloguing me, anticipating my every action. By the fourth day, I could no longer ignore the dread building in my chest. The notes had become unnervingly specific. They described my movements throughout the cabin, even when I thought I was alone in a room. One note read, "You're pacing while you read this." I hadn't written anything, had barely paused, yet there it was, reflecting me back with eerie precision. I began to leave the notes untouched, trying to pretend they weren't there, but each morning I found a new one, personalized, intimate, and entirely unavoidable. I could no longer eat or drink without a creeping sense of surveillance, a creeping terror that someone, or some presence, was cataloguing my life down to the smallest detail. The final night, I couldn't stay. I packed in silence, photographing the notes as evidence, though I knew no one would believe me. As I left the cabin, the wind in the trees seemed to whisper around me, carrying an echo of the notes themselves. I tried to tell myself it was coincidence, imagination, the result of isolation and fatigue. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew that cabin, that old, quiet house in the mountains, had learned me in ways no human could. Even now, months later, whenever I see a refrigerator covered in magnets, my heart lurches. I recall the small, handwritten notes predicting my movements, recording my habits, knowing me in ways I had never told anyone. The feeling is not just memory, it is persistent, a shadow that follows the mundane act of opening a fridge, the innocuous familiarity of magnets and scraps of paper. I cannot explain how it happened, cannot rationalize it, and I do not want to. Some quiet corners of the mountains hold knowledge and observation far beyond what seems possible, patient and silent. That cabin taught me that. And the lesson lingers in the smallest ways, subtle, unnerving, impossible to escape. I never return to that area of the mountains, but sometimes I think of the notes. Sometimes I wonder if they continue. If the next guest opens the fridge and sees my movements recorded, my habits catalogued, every step predicted, I think of the quiet patience in the house, in the stones and the walls, waiting to observe, to record, to reflect without ever revealing itself. Even now, when I close my eyes at night, I feel it in the corners of my mind, the precise, intimate knowledge of a stranger who never existed, yet always watched. The memory doesn't fade. The notes, the magnets, the careful predictions, they are a shadow across my life. A reminder of how quietly, how fully, we can be observed without ever knowing it. And in the quiet moments, when the world is still and the hum of daily life fades, I can almost hear the soft scratch of pen on paper, a gentle whisper cataloguing my movements once again, patient, deliberate, and impossible to confront. That cabin is gone from my life, yet it persists in memory, in the way a cold wind seems to follow you, in the way a silence carries knowledge you would rather not possess. Story 8. The Vanishing Guest. I arrived at the Airbnb in the late afternoon, the sun slanting low across the mountain ridges, casting the cabin and surrounding forest into long, shifting shadows. The road up had been narrow and winding, flanked by thick pines, and I had driven slowly, half to enjoy the scenery and half because the gravel surface made sudden swerves dangerous. The cabin itself looked modest but inviting. A simple structure of weathered wood with a small porch and a stone chimney that seemed to lean slightly to one side, as if settling into the mountains over decades. I parked and stretched, taking in the stillness of the place. There was no other sound but the faint rustle of wind through the trees and the distant cry of a crow. Already, I could feel the oppressive quiet pressing against me, the kind of isolation that makes every small noise unnervingly loud. When I stepped inside, the host greeted me warmly, but with a faint hesitation I didn't notice at first. "Oh," she said, "you might notice some things left behind. A coat, a backpack, a notebook. The last guest just forgot them, I suppose." I glanced at the items lying neatly on a chair and table. The coat was dark and worn, the backpack patched and dusty, and the notebook's cover was scuffed, a small spiral of notes and scribbles visible on its edges. I nodded politely, thinking it odd but not concerning. People leave things behind all the time. The host insisted it wasn't a problem, and I set my own bag down, trying to ignore the strange, unclaimed items as I settled in. The first night passed quietly enough. I unpacked, made some tea in the small kitchenette, and carried it to the living area. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine, the furniture worn but comfortable. Still, the presence of the forgotten belongings made the air feel heavier, as if someone had been here very recently. I tried to shake it off, attributing it to imagination. I had stayed in isolated cabins before and knew the mind could play tricks when the mountains pressed in from all sides. But as the night deepened, a subtle unease began to creep over me, like a shadow brushing against the edges of my awareness. Around midnight, I woke to the faint sound of movement. At first, I assumed it was the floorboards settling, the wind rattling the windows. Then I heard it again, a soft creak, the slight shuffle of feet. My heart thudded. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. It was coming from the living area, where the abandoned coat and backpack lay. The sound of drawers opening followed, then the faint whisper of my name. "Emily," it seemed to murmur, barely audible, almost as if the cabin itself had spoken. My hands shook as I swung my legs out of bed and crept toward the door. I flicked on the light in the hallway. Everything appeared untouched. The coat hung neatly on its chair, the backpack and notebook in their original positions. I called out softly, "Hello? Is someone there?" There was no reply, only silence, thick and still. A chill ran down my spine. I went to inspect the drawers that had seemed to move. They were closed, aligned as I had left them. I checked the corners of the room, under tables and behind furniture. Empty. No one was there. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening. Occasionally, I thought I heard soft footfalls, fleeting and careful, moving through the cabin's empty rooms. Every time I strained to pinpoint them, the sound would vanish, as if retreating just beyond my hearing. Sleep became impossible, my body tense, my mind alert to every whisper, every creak, every shifting shadow. By morning, I was exhausted, haunted by the uncanny sensation of another presence. When I emerged from the bedroom, I noticed the belongings were gone. The coat, the backpack, and the notebook had vanished. I blinked, my pulse quickening. I asked the host, who shrugged apologetically. "I must have taken them to clean the room," she said. There was nothing more to be said, and I told myself I should be relieved that the strange presence was gone. But even as I moved about the cabin, the oppressive quiet remained. It felt less like peace and more like a vacuum, an emptiness pressing against the walls, making me aware of my own breathing and heartbeat in a way that was almost painful. Over the following days, the sense of another presence didn't fade. I would pass through the living area and feel the brush of movement at my peripheral vision, like someone had just passed behind a doorway. Drawers I had left closed would sometimes be slightly ajar. The floors creaked beneath invisible weight, the pattern of footsteps echoing where no one should have walked. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table, my laptop open, and I thought I heard a chair scrape softly across the floor behind me. I spun around. Empty. I called out, my voice catching in my throat, and only the silence answered. I began noticing small, inexplicable details. A notebook I hadn't touched seemed to have shifted slightly on the table. I could swear a coat I hadn't worn was draped differently across the chair. The patterns of movement were subtle, deliberate, not random, not the quirks of an old house. The cabin seemed alive in some impossible way, cataloguing my habits, responding to my actions. The sensation was profoundly unsettling, more so than any loud noise or visible threat. It wasn't a presence that attacked or revealed itself. It merely existed alongside me, patient, meticulous, impossible to confront. By the end of the week, I was unable to sleep without the lights on. Every creak, every whisper, every fleeting shadow kept me alert, heart pounding, listening for the inevitable signs that the other guest, or whatever remained of them, was moving through the cabin. Even when I left the bedroom, I felt eyes on me, weightless but heavy, following, observing. I tried to reason it away. Perhaps the host had a family member checking on the cabin. Perhaps the old floorboards produced imagined footsteps. Perhaps it was my imagination heightened by isolation, but no explanation ever fully satisfied the sense of being watched. Finally, I left. I packed hurriedly, my hands trembling, my mind replaying the sounds of that first night, the drawers opening, the soft whisper of my name, the invisible footsteps pacing through the rooms. The host seemed surprised at my early departure, but didn't question me further. I drove down the narrow mountain road, the cabin receding into the shadows of the trees. Yet I could not shake the feeling that the house had followed me in some intangible way, carrying the echo of footsteps and whispered names beyond its walls. Weeks later, I still feel it. The memory of the vanished guest, the inexplicable movement, the whispered words. It lingers in quiet moments. Sometimes when I walk through old houses or visit friends in cabins, I sense the same presence just beyond my awareness, moving silently, cataloguing, patient. The sense of someone living alongside you, unseen yet known, is a weight that does not fade easily. The memory is subtle but persistent, a low hum beneath ordinary life, reminding me that some presences do not need doors to enter, nor invitations to remain. I often wonder what became of that guest whose belongings were left behind. Were they ever truly gone, or did a fragment of them linger, bound to the cabin in some inexplicable way? The host never mentioned them again. The room was cleared, and yet the quiet movements, the soft echoes of steps, remained. I have returned to the mountains only once, and even then, the forest seemed to press close, heavy with quiet observation, as though aware of my presence before I had arrived. I left quickly, heart hammering, and the memory of those nights in the cabin has haunted me ever since. Even now, I catch myself imagining drawers opening on their own, whispering names that I cannot quite place, fleeting shadows retreating just beyond reach. The vanishing guest was never seen again, yet in memory and sensation, they were never gone. The cabin remains a quiet sentinel in the mountains, a place where one can be watched, catalogued, and followed without ever meeting the observer. And in that knowledge, in the persistent, unnerving echo of someone moving silently through empty rooms, I am left with a quiet terror that refuses to fade, a reminder that some presences linger long after the physical traces are gone,